human beings can actually change the very nature of the earth.
Because we are already at the tipping point.
The smoke that is being emitted blankets the entire area.
People who live close to the land are going to be harmed.
And it's not just about the animals in the forest.
It's the people's forests that are being logged.
They signed a deal with the government, essentially.
Sell your land. If you don't sell your land, we're going to mine around you.
And if you take that away from me, I've got nothing else. I've got nowhere else to go.
I'm completely convinced that environmental policy and environmental law is based upon decisions that a country makes, and decisions in the law, and then you enforce the law. And it's not this human rights sort of theoretical stuff. And then she started introducing me to cases.
I would start from the point when I never thought about this connection. And for me, that was a very important invitation to come to Geneva in January 2002. It was an expert seminar organized by UN High Commission of Human Rights and United Nations Environmental Program. And I met High Commissioner of Human Rights Mary Robinson, who is former President of Ireland. And I talked to her, and I was impressed by experts, 23 experts from around the world, from both fields. And as you know, probably, that these experts from both fields, they fight all the time. And human rights people would say, you environmentalist, your rights do not exist, it's animal rights, And if we recognize environmental rights, it means we dilute fundamental human rights. And environmental people, like in Rio in 1992, I know they will say, you human rights people care only about people, and we care about environment. So you are like, put people in the center of universe, and it's not right. So then I started this Human Rights to All program immediately after I came from that meeting in Geneva. I was inspired, and I started to teach this course. And more and more I realized, and I teach it already for 7 years, and then I decided, every year I have to update this course material. Finally I need to have a book. And I invited him to be my co-author, and he said, I don't believe in that connection. I will help you to edit anyway. And I said, no, I seriously want you to be a co-author and have some responsibilities. And finally he agreed.
And I would say that in reading the cases and searching for cases, because again, I don't believe it if some professor writes about it. I want to know what has actually happened on the ground, what has happened in the courts. And I was certainly aware of a case in Pennsylvania in which it appeared that the court said, these constitutional, there may be environmental right in our Constitution, but it's not really serious. But then we found this case in Montana in which they actually overturned legislation of the legislature on the basis that it violated the Constitution protection for environmental rights. And then we found a case in Hungary where they overturned legislation. And then we found a case in the Philippines where they said that even children can defend the rights of future generations. And then a case in Chile saying that legislation there restricting standing to sue was invalid because it violated the constitutional environmental rights. And then Svitlana started finding all these things in the international human rights courts.
Yes, and we found cases, and some of our ELAW friends were behind those cases, like case Opoza versus Factoran is famous, and it's many books. And we know attorney Opoza, who presented a case on behalf of future generations, unborn, on the right to a healthy environment. And the decision was written beautifully by Supreme Court judge of Supreme Court of Philippines, And the language was like, we have to stop hemorrhage of bleeding earth, and we need to protect mangrove forests from logging and stop all logging because our future generations will not enjoy the resources of Philippines. And in fact, they stopped all logging by just recognizing right to a healthy and balanced environment in the Constitution of Philippines.
And maybe there's a lesson there for us. I believe that the reason that we decided that human rights and the environment are actually one topic, not two, is because our friends around the world taught us. You know, we came at this, Svitlana from her perspective and training in the Soviet Union and so forth, me from my training in the United States, and so we knew our world, and we started to meet people, and we started to create this network. And they started telling us things that aren't even in our courts or our jurisprudence or even our thinking. So in a very real way, the partners of ELAW around the world brought things to us and broadened our view. And now we're both convinced that actually human rights and the environment are one subject. They're indissoluble.
Listen, I think that also that was very important. We participated in negotiation of the Aarhus Convention. Convention with a strange name. In Europe, conventions have the name of the city where they sign. Aarhus is a city in Denmark, but convention is on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters. And we both were involved in negotiations as citizen diplomats on behalf of European Coalition of Non-Governmental Organizations, ECOFORUM. And we had our right for the first time in the international negotiations to have our right to say, sitting together with the ministers, and to be heard. And some of the formulations of the convention are actually proposed by non-governmental organizations. And then later I was involved in ratification of this convention by all countries of former Soviet Union and Mongolia. I traveled to all of those countries and tried to convince the parliament, government, and NGOs to ratify the convention, trying to convince them this is environmental democracy, environmental rights, you need to have it. And that was a pretty successful project because when convention entered into force, 17 countries ratified the convention, 12 were countries of former Soviet Union.
It's probably surprising to think that ordinary citizens or their organizations could take part in diplomatic negotiations. That was a surprise to us, I think. And it's also that people think of environmental law as something you maybe practice in the courts or maybe you lobby your national legislature. But the idea that environmental lawyers could actually influence international processes was pretty amazing. And in this case, in this particular convention or treaty, that's what happened, is that the citizen groups were allowed to participate. They couldn't vote or anything, but they could make suggestions. And I remember one event in particular where I had started to look at the constitutions of other countries, and the representatives, the diplomats from Germany, were claiming, they cannot give standing to sue, they can't allow people to come to court without certain very strict restrictions because of their constitution. And I had been reading on this, and I knew they were wrong. So I leaned over to the head of our delegation and started saying to him, those lawyers from Germany, they're just lying about what's in the Constitution. It's just not true. And suddenly the whole room of diplomats started laughing. I looked down and I saw that my elbow had hit the button to turn on the speaker. And this was not only being said to everybody, but it was being translated as well into many languages. So I learned that citizens have a lot to learn, and one is don't press the button at the wrong time.
And you have to behave very in civilized manner, otherwise the whole NGO coalition will be thrown out of negotiation. Yeah. And can I finish? That the most exciting thing that now I am sitting in the compliance committee which implements this convention. So John didn't believe in international law.
That's true.
And then he saw that actually the convention is happening and the countries are taking accountable for their compliance with the convention, and it's already been 5.5 years and 36 cases, and I enjoy that. It's quasi-judicial body, and I feel like we can make some change by participating in this compliance committee.
We hear a lot of people, especially in the U.S., I'd say, associate the environmental movement with saving whales and butterflies and trees, and we hear less about this human component of it, right? And in the developing world, the sense that I have, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that it's the other way around. So people are much more connected to the environmental issues through their human livelihoods and communities and well-being. So who's not doing, are human rights organizations not talking enough about it, or are environmental organizations not talking enough about it? Where was this misconception born?
I think it may have something to do with the history of the environmental movement in the United States. The environmental movement in the United States, one place to trace it back to is the late 1800s, when, after westward expansion, there was a lot of cutting of forests, and we had presidents step in and say, wait a minute, we have to preserve some forests. They created the National Forest System. About the same time, they were starting to think about some of the other issues, and by the mid-20th century, they decided that maybe we needed to deal with water pollution and air pollution. Now, those might have a human component, but those laws were extremely weak. In the mid-1960s, they passed the Wilderness Act. It's about nature. They passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It's about nature. And even when they started talking about pollution, the people who were working on the issue were middle class and above. They were not people in lower economic strata. And so, actually, about 15 or 20 years ago, marginalized groups in the United States started complaining about the American environmental movement. Groups, people of color in New Orleans, in Arizona, and so forth, and they actually sent a letter to the 10 biggest environmental organizations saying, hey, how about humans? You know, why are you people not paying attention to poor people, to discrimination that comes through pollution, and so forth? And that's the point at which the U.S. environmental movement sort of stopped and said, whoa, maybe we've been looking at this, only part of this picture, not the rest of the picture. Now, I would say that nobody ever looks at the full picture, but I think that that's when it started to happen. At the same time, the human rights movement sort of grew up on its own and sort of didn't have anything to do with the environmental side, maybe because the environmentalists were all worried about whales and forests and important things, but they weren't looking in that direction either. One more thing. I think that the combination occurred more at the international level, and that it's still not truly integrated in the United States. I think in the United States environmental movement and the United States human rights movement, they're still this far apart. Whereas in other countries, they actually started together. In some countries, they're growing together, perhaps parts of Europe. But here, I think a lot of work still needs to be done with Americans to recognize that it actually is artificially split, and we need to bring it back together.
So, from the perspective of developing world, you ask about that. I think that in developing countries, first of all, environmental protection is a luxury, and you have to have money to protect the environment. And in Rio in '92, Rio, conference on environment and development, and even in Stockholm before, the developing countries were talking about we need to develop, and they are talking about right to development. And developed countries said there is no such right. And then finally they formulated it as a right for sustainable development. But developing countries very early in that process started to talk about environment in terms of rights. And if you live in the country like Ecuador, and if you see polluted rivers and environment and air, and you do not have safe drinking water, and you not have clean air, and you have diseases, And you start to realize that your health is in danger because you drink this polluted water. Like in Pablo Fajardo's story about Chevron coming to pristine country and making it so polluted that now people are dying of cancer. So then it's naturally to put this in the context of human rights. And in many negotiations on Biodiversity Convention, Climate Change Convention, that North and South, they had conflicts, and I think that because they have different perspectives of environmental protection.
For the people who still haven't made that connection, who may watch some of these clips, what would be the top 3 areas that you would say are the most pressing ones today at that intersection of environmental and human rights, globally and...
Could I say first? I'm sorry.
I know what you're going to say, and I agree with you.
So first, emerging field is climate change. And now Human Rights Council recently, like 1 week ago, issued a report about the connection between human rights and climate change. And to talk about climate change only in terms of cap and trade and emission reduction, it's not enough, because we have to think about environmental climate change, refugees, people being, like Tuvalu, being replaced, or they need to replace because the island will be underwater. And I think another issue is corporate accountability in the sphere of corporations coming to beautiful, pristine countries and making huge damage to the environment and people's health.
And the third one probably are procedural environmental rights. That is the right of access to information, the right to participate, and the right to go to court to defend these things. Now, people might say, well, you don't need to talk about human rights if you want to talk about that. Just talk about access to information. But it's not whether the government wants to give us information. It's we have a right to information. And that has become an internationally accepted right. It's still working on it, but basically there are now courts that are saying this is actually a fundamental human right. And people say, access to information? Well, it started with Chernobyl. It started in Svitlana's country, where the government, after a nuclear power plant exploded, for several days they hid the information from the public. And even children went out on a May Day parade and they had the radiation raining on their heads because the government was not telling them anything. And that became a dramatic event, such that the country even makes it criminal responsibility now if you withhold critical information.
And constitutional right to environmental information in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, and then the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe said, oh, this is actually a human right. And now what's happening is the courts are interpreting the right of freedom of expression, which is usually phrased in constitutions and human rights treaties as the right to receive and give information. They're saying that means the right to get documents, to get things from the government. So they're turning that into a constitutional
And it
right.
is in European Court of Human Rights, and it is in Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They create jurisprudence where they recognize freedom of expression and opinion, and part of that is the right to receive environmental information. And they also interpret fundamental human rights like right to life, a right to health, right to family life and privacy in European Convention. They recognize those rights related to environment, and they use those rights interpretation for the protection of the environment from degradation.
And it's probably difficult to say what are the top 3 because we're leaving out several that we think are really important. Indigenous rights,
yes.
The right to water, the
right to land, right to culture, like Inuit community.
And these are all parts of both the environment and even traditional human rights. I think that the other question to think about is why is this not a natural conversation? I think part of it is that social classes who form the conversation, the people who write for newspapers or the people who go to law school or whatever, people can buy their way out of the environmental problem. You know, if you've got enough money and you don't need much more than a middle-class existence, you can decide not to live in Cancer Alley, Louisiana. But the people who live there and who know that's a human right issue, they don't have the voice. Therefore, they're not heard. So I think part of it is to change our frame of reference from why we are thinking this. Are we really thinking about what's happening to people who have no alternatives, or we only think about our own comfort? And if we think about ourselves, of course, I want to go canoeing, I want to see wildlife. That's an important thing to me. But when you start to meet people from around the world for whom the environment is literally life or death, then you have to say, well, maybe it is human rights, maybe I live in my sort of part of the society, and I should broaden my vision.
We watched 2 days ago this new movie, Crude, which we will see in 1 hour. And I thought about these children who are sick, who are dying of cancer, and they show how the children play in the water, which is polluted. And I said, why in the world they play in this water and wash in this water? And John said, because they do not have any other water. And they have no choice. And it's, it's so moving.
The whole thing about human rights being separated from the environment is that it came from the fact that the initial sort of worldwide concern with human rights came out of the genocide in Europe, in Nazi Germany, in the Nuremberg trials. And then you got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, of course, they were talking about the right not to be arbitrarily tortured, the right of freedom of speech, and various other rights. And then that Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave birth to two covenants that countries could sign or not sign, could ratify or not. The first was civil and political rights. It's the same thing. What is my right to vote? What is my right to religion? And so forth. Civil and political rights.
But in those covenants and in the Universal Declaration, there weren't environmental rights and no environment at all because...
No mention.
Because at that time, we didn't have real environmental problems. And that was 48 and 56, so and then they enter into 466. It's still no environmental problems.
No understanding of environmental problems 40 years ago.
In terms of human rights.
In terms of human rights.
And later, because we still live with these main human rights conventions, and we couldn't change them completely. But what our courts are doing in international courts and also on national level, they interpreting fundamental human rights recognized by everybody, like right to life, right to health, right to culture, right to self-determination, right to property, land. They turn it towards environment and interpret in a way that it's connected to.
So one reason we wrote the book is to tell the human rights lawyers and professors and students, hey, there's another aspect of human rights, and to tell the environmental students and lawyers and professors, hey, there's another aspect of the environment too that's human.
What would you say to the human rights movement today? One thing, if you can say one thing, what would you say?
Take off the blindfold. Take off the blindfold, because human rights people know very well that when you're blindfolded and then tortured, that's part of being tortured, is being blindfolded. But if the human rights organizations also have a blindfold in which they're only thinking about what they thought about before, and they're not looking at people, they need to listen to people from other countries and not only look at their own sort of training. And of course they do, but they need to listen to a broader spectrum. They need to listen to the people who will tell them that if my child gets sick, it's a violation of my child's human right. Not just tell them if I'm beaten in jail, it's a violation of human rights. So the human rights community needs to broaden its vision.
I just came from a social justice retreat in Stanford. There were a lot of panels about torture and prisons and human rights violations, and one little panel about connection between human rights and environment. And I think that my message would be consider that polluted environment and for poor people no choice except live in the polluted environment is a torture. Or they are in sort of prison that they cannot go to another place and live in clean environment. They just have no means to do that.
If you're addressing these local communities who are facing some of these challenges, what would be your one message?
Get a good lawyer and support that lawyer. Because communities can try to mount political protests, but there are legal tools available. And yet, there's no money. If a student wants to become an environmental or human rights lawyer, they have a very small number of options. And the communities need to understand that to support that kind of lawyer doing human rights and environmental work is just as important as to go in the streets with placards and make a demonstration. That's my message to them is understand that you have friends even when they wear suits and ties or suit dresses.
My message would be consider using a human rights approach and human rights tools, not only environmental laws to protect the environment. And I believe that human rights have advantages, like that human rights treaties are very strong. When you go to the court and you talk about human rights, the judge will listen more carefully than you will talk about butterflies. And the case law is established on domestic level and on international level. And these cases, they cannot be negotiated like, we will pay you some money, we will compensate for the polluted environment. If you talk about right to life, there is no compromise. It's language which is very strong. I believe that you can achieve more success using this human rights language.
I would say another thing to the communities, and that is, don't hire a lawyer from out of town. What I mean is, the expert is defined as somebody who you don't know. The expert is from New York. The expert is from the United States. The expert is from Sao Paulo, Brazil. But the problem is that unless you train your own local experts, the people who fly in, they parachute in, as the Brazilians say, and they're gone. What you need is to build within your community your own resources, and that means when you do manage to get enough money together to hire somebody, hire the local person who's going to live with you for the next 40 years. Don't go outside, don't go abroad, and don't go to the capital, because those people will help you even after the money runs out because they're part of your community.
Or like Pablo Fajardo, working without money because he lives in that community, he knows people, and he suffers the same consequences of polluted environment.
Why is Pablo Fajardo so remarkable?
First of all, because of his commitment to the community, to the people, to the environment, because he wasn't afraid that his brother was murdered and his friend was killed. And probably he was scared, but he continued his work. And I read stories in Vanity Fair. Now I met him in person. He's a normal person, but he's my hero because I think he's a model for other public interest environmental lawyers how to live their life and how to create the job for the rest of his life, how to protect his land and his community.
I would say the other reason why Pablo Fajardo is special is that he didn't leave. Anybody with that education that he got, he could have gone to the capital, to Quito, he could have made money, but he hasn't left. And he's only special in comparison to people who make the choice to go for money. He's not special compared to the other members of the human rights environmental law community that we have in ELAW and that perhaps you've interviewed. All those people have that same special characteristic, but they're like each other. They decided not to leave into a higher social class, not to leave to a fancier job, not to leave to another place, not to move away. They're rooted where they are, and maybe it's not special, but it's something that is fundamental.
It is special.
Two more people I'd like you to send messages to. One is the U.S. government, now that we have this new administration, And the other one is for the meeting that's going to happen later this year in Copenhagen. What would be a message that you would send?
Oh, I love this topic.
I'll leave Svitlana to talk about Copenhagen, and I'll talk about the U.S. government.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But I cannot avoid saying how happy I am to have new president and administration, and as a citizen of U.S. for the first time I vote for this president, and I'm so happy with this president, and I believe that change is coming, and on international level, because John will say more about U.S., I think that for talks in Copenhagen, everybody knows that it's climate change convention, next meeting of the parties. It's necessary to do some homework in the United States and then to come to negotiations well prepared and to tell the world that U.S. are at the table for negotiations, and I hope U.S. will tell we are the leaders of this process. And I believe that with this leading role, U.S. will convince China to be at the table and to participate in the new treaty, which probably will be Copenhagen Protocol, and to reach a difficult consensus between developed and developing countries towards our mutual goal to stop climate change from happening, because we are already at the tipping point. So we have to work very hard, and we have not much time left.
I would say to the new administration, the U.S. government, remember that before you came to this high position, you were community organizers. Barack Obama was. Remember that you got elected by community organizers. I mean by grassroots people who donated money, who went out in the streets, students and so forth, registered people, got them to vote. It wasn't the corporations that elected Barack Obama. And yet, there's always this possibility of slipping back into the old ways. And so I would say to them, remember where you came from and who brought you there. And what that means is they need to support the public interest law movement. They need to support a lot of public interest movement, but that includes the people who are struggling. They need to support the students who want a career. How does it mean to support them? Well, if we defeat the government in a lawsuit, they shouldn't fight about, well, maybe we won't let the court order that attorney fees be paid to you. Maybe they need to agree, since the law says they should pay the attorney fees of these lawyers, pay the money, pay the fees. And when the lawyer for a citizen group asks for information, they shouldn't say, we're going to fight them every step of the way. They should give the information. And if some bureaucrat doesn't give the information and a lawsuit is filed for the information, they should settle the lawsuit. They should give the information. What I'm saying is there are 1,000 ways every day that a bureaucracy can make decisions to support the community, and that wouldn't violate any oath of office. That would simply be not violating the oath to corporate power. They need to somehow recognize that every day they are still responsible to the community, not to the politicians they elected the previous generations of presidents. This is a completely new political space. I hope it doesn't close down.
I hope too, because the first day when President Obama was in the office, he issued a memo to executive agencies about new era of transparency and openness and accountability of the government towards citizens. And the order is to answer every request of every citizen. So I believe that is something very hopeful, as well as all statements made by Obama and his administration about climate change, creating green jobs and alternative energy commitment, and all of that. I believe that it's a good message.
Well, my belief is if you're going to play poker with your mother, you still cut the cards.
Don't trust your government.
I don't trust any government, including the one that I helped to elect. although Obama signed a memorandum about transparency, his lawyers in the Justice Department are still fighting against colleagues that I have on Freedom of Information requests. They are still resisting attorney fee award requests. They are still, Obama himself is advocating something that does not exist, clean coal. There is no clean coal. So I'm actually concerned that the public, my message is not to Obama or to the administration. My message is to the public interest community, and that's keep your powder dry. Don't trust even your friends to do the right thing until you push them to do the right thing. Because I think that we don't know yet whether we will win or not. We just simply elected a good guy, but whether he'll remain good is up to us.